feel old? The Hobbit, the Battle of the Five Armies is 10 years old this year. You stupid! Anyway, I remember going to see this movie in the theaters. I would have been 11, and I would have been going to see this movie for my 12th birthday, I believe, with my dad and my older brother. At the time, young Josh loved The Hobbit, the Battle of the Five Armies. But it's been 10 years, and I've read a little bit more Tolkien lore, and my taste is a little bit more refined. So let's look back on this. I guess now it's a classic, it still feels new. See how it compared to The Lord of the Rings, other movies, and how we rate this movie 10 years later. Let's start with the good. I think there's an underrated amount of good parts in this movie. This has some really awesome scenes. Thorin's dragon sickness was actually really impeccable and well done. I think the acting done by the actor of Thorin was really, really impressive, and I think it's underrated. I think audiences want him to be an Aragorn-esque character when these are two different characters, and Thorin's problem with the dragon sickness is actually a really lovely representation of how evil that greed can become. This is probably closer to Tolkien's philosophy with his characters and with his general understanding of creativity. While it's impossible to really ascribe any kind of motive to anything Tolkien overwrote, evil was bad and good was good, and these were clearly defined. And Tolkien's good guys fought for good. Thorin in the movie and the book struggled with his obsession with gold, so much so that he started casting aside his kin. But at a certain point, his obsession with the gold and the wealth, it became too much. He was literally obsessing over all of this metal, this shiny metal, while his kin was sitting waiting to go in battle, and his cousins were literally getting slaughtered in the Battle of the Five Armies, and he just sat there with all of his money. The thought probably dawned on him that, gold has value, I suppose, but what good is it if everyone you know and love is dead outside? Which is a really powerful lesson to take into life, that money really isn't all that great if, what do you have to spend it on? It never accomplished anything. Money can be a great tool for accomplishing great good, but if all of your kin is dead, what does it matter? And Thorin realizes his value and his wealth is really in his kin and his nephews and his dwarven brothers and not in money. Even though they completely went CGI in The Hobbit versus The Lord of the Rings, everything, all the battles, it was all CGI. It was still pretty cool. I really love seeing massive armies clash. Unfortunately, that's about all we got for the good. My number one issue with the Battle of the Five Armies and the Hobbit series in general is Tauriel. Tauriel is not a Tolkien character. I won't go as far as to say that the writers of the Five Armies or the writers of the Hobbit, Peter Jackson, I won't say these people are bad writers. What I will say is that J.R.R. Tolkien was the single greatest writer of fiction that ever lived. To think that you can make a better character than Tolkien is asinine. Sure, you could write a good character, but you are not as good as Tolkien. So right off the bat, you're losing. Any of your movie characters that are based off of Tolkien's characters are going to be great because they were created by one of the greatest authors ever to live. But when you write a character yourself, you're just not as good as Tolkien. My next problem with Tauriel is that Keely is the last dwarf that would fall in love with an elf, other than maybe Thorin and Dane. You see, the rivalry between dwarves and elves goes so far back. And what they tried to do is try to have a similar dynamic to Legolas and Gimli, as these people of different races coming together despite their differences, actually having a lovely relationship. But they did it so much worse than Legolas and Gimli. For one thing, there wasn't that bonding experience that Legolas and Gimli had, where they were binded by the quest, by the Fellowship of the Ring, and by the purpose of their mission, and they fought side by side, and that built their relationship. What built Tauriel and Keely's relationship was Keely getting captured and thrown in prison. What is that called? Stockholm Syndrome? It just makes no sense. These people who already hate each other off the bat somehow fall in love when they're thrown into prison. That's not chemistry. This goes all the way back to the creation of elves and dwarves. Elves, like men, were created by Eru Ilúvatar. They're considered the children of Eru Ilúvatar, who is the high god in the Lord of the Rings universe. The dwarves were created by one of the sub-gods known as, he's one of the Valar. His name is Aule, and he creates the dwarves. But Eru Ilúvatar was kind of like, bruh, you tripping? Why'd you do this? I was making the people. And Eru Ilúvatar was actually gonna smite the dwarves and wipe them all out. But Aule pleaded with him, and they ended up shutting up the dwarves in a mountain for, many years until the children of Eru Ilúvatar were awakened, and then later on, the elves and the men and the dwarves would all interact. Early on in the Tolkien universe, the elves and the dwarves got along well, but there were multiple fallings out in the course of the Silmarillion. And obviously, as you see in the prologue to the first Hobbit movie, there was a massive falling out with the woodland elves and the dwarves of Erebor right when Smaug came and took over Erebor. So this rivalry runs so deep, and it makes no sense for Tauriel and Keely to get together when they were thrown in prison because, I don't know, did they find each other pretty? You're grasping at straws here. There's a lot more to love than pretty faces. While Legolas and Gimli came together pretty much by accident, they didn't really like each other. They were connected by by the quest of the ring. They fought all these battles, they became close together, and what you don't see in the Return of the King is that Legolas would end up sailing to the Undying Lands, where at the end of the Return of the King you see Gandalf and Frodo and Bilbo sailing off to. And Legolas brings Gimli, which is the only character in the history of the entire Lord of the Rings universe, as far as I know, to go to the Undying Lands, the only dwarf where he would die there in the Undying Lands with the Valar. So the relationship was poorly done, especially compared to Legolas and Gimli. Shocker, because Tolkien wrote Legolas and Gimli, and a bunch of underpaid hippies wrote Tauriel and Keely. My next problem with Tauriel is this feminist push. They want to have these female fierce warriors, which again is an oxymoron as far as I'm concerned, which you're welcome to hate me for. But what about Éowyn? She was a fierce female warrior. Again, remember, Tolkien wrote Éowyn. Bunch of underpaid teenagers wrote Tauriel. The reason why Éowyn was really likable is not because she was actually a warrior. Éowyn never really had an interest in war. Well, you come to learn, especially more in the books, but it's also kind of there in the movies. Éowyn never really wanted to be a warrior. It happened to be that her people needed warriors. Her brother and her cousin were warriors, and her uncle was a warrior. Her cousin died in war, and so did her uncle. She felt like the thing she had to do to be accepted by them and to be worthy would be to be a warrior. Her feminine self wanted to be a princess of Rohan, but she had no room to be that person. After the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, she actually meets Faramir. They come together, and it's a beautiful scene in the book when it says something to the effect of the cloud was lifted off of Éowyn's life, the dark cloud. For once, Éowyn was allowed to be a woman and not a warrior. But it becomes even more poetic when Éowyn kills the Witch King of the Nazgûl, because all of this adversity and strife ended up being necessary for the greater good in the end. How else would the Witch King have been killed, since no man can kill him? Tauriel's motivation is different. She's just kind of automatically as good at fighting as the boys, which I don't know, you can make a case for that because they are elves and a different race than people, you know, in reality we're people and we're not elves, and it's weird to see women warriors. I'll say it. It's not right. War is for boys and war is not for girls. That's not to say that girls can't support or, you know, be helpful, but fighting and killing and being a warrior is not for girls, and audiences do not like seeing girls do that, and that's part of the reason why Rings of Power sucks. Rings of Power is supposed to be based on the Similar Alien, but Galadriel is barely in the Similar Alien, and she's certainly not really a warrior in the Similar Alien. Even further, we have Legolas in this movie, and he's got a big part in Tauriel's relationship. He's kind of got a crush on her, but she doesn't have a crush on him, so it's this awkward love triangle between the three of those characters. Surprise, surprise, Legolas is in the Lord of the Rings, and he's a woodland elf, and he would have been alive at the time of the Battle of the Five Armies, but he's not in the book. He's not a part of this in any way in the book. So when you try to write a character in that isn't there originally, again, you're going up against Tolkien. Your story is gonna not be as good as his. Next, there's a stark contrast between just the look and the feel of the Hobbit trilogy versus the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Look at these two shots. Look at the shot of these orcs, these Uruk-hai marching in the Lord of the Rings, and now this shot of the Hobbit orcs charging into battle. They look significantly different. I suppose the creators thought that CGI would be at the point where you couldn't tell, but you could tell when there's actual costumes and they look more detailed. They look blocky and stock generated in the Hobbit. The Battle of the Five Armies got caught up in an unfortunate time in history when there was a massive push for special effects, because we were at this point where we'd made so much progress, and so many movies nowadays are being remade because of how much better special effects are. But audiences, surprised, they just don't really like it. They can tell when it's special effects. It doesn't feel real. And so nowadays we're seeing a little bit of a push back to the practical effects, and you'll see that in Rings of Power when the orcs go back to being actual actors with actual costumes instead of being entirely CGI generated. The next challenge the Battle of the Five Armies experiences is, for one thing, that the Battle of the Five Armies is literally like just a few pages in the book. Tolkien didn't write any Battle of the Five Armies. That's the chapter, that's the title of one of the chapters. What happens in the book is that Bilbo literally gets knocked out by a rock and misses the entire battle. And since we're hearing the story from Bilbo's perspective, we're third person following Bilbo, we literally don't see any of the Battle of the Five Armies in the book. So the entire movie pretty much had to be written by the people and not by Tolkien, which is a heavy burden. Not saying they're bad writers, but they're not as good as Tolkien, and that's why this movie not only is not as good as the other Hobbit movies, but not as good as any of the Tolkien movies. The thing about battle scenes and violence in movies is it has to progress the plot, otherwise it's just pointless violence. Check out this scene of Darth Vader versus Obi-Wan Kenobi.
I've been waiting for you, Obi-Wan. We meet again at last. The circle is now complete. When I left you, I was but the learner. Now I am the master.
Only a master of evil, Darth.
When I was really young, I found this scene absolutely boring because I wanted, you know, fighting and action and lasers. But this battle is actually really, really good because while it's a bunch of old people swinging around lightsabers, they pause every 5 seconds to have a dialogue, which advances the plot.
Your powers are weak, old man.
A lot of these scenes in the Battle of the Five Army are egregiously violent for the sake of being egregiously violent, especially in the extended edition. It's fun and it's cool, but all this killing doesn't advance the plot. There are scenes in which it does advance the plot, like when the dwarves are pushed back against the mountain, and Thorin and the other dwarves emerge and fight back. We're actually seeing a geography change, and this means a change in Thorin's character, so these battle scenes do progress the plot, but there's way too many battle scenes that just do nothing for our story. Next, this movie tried to do a whole lot of foreshadowing to The Lord of the Rings, which again would be good, except when you consider the time period of when this came out, it's not hitting the right audience. The audience who was going to the Hobbit movies in 2014 were people who loved The Lord of the Rings. So the people who went to see this movie knew the events of The Lord of the Rings, and this foreshadowing didn't serve any purpose for them. This foreshadowing will be very cool when when Hobbit fans show these movies to their kids 20 years from now, and when they start with The Hobbit and show it to the kids chronologically. But for the rest of us, the foreshadowing just isn't right. We already know what happens. It's not that useful to us. Finally, one of the bigger challenges that the Battle of the Five Armies faces is a confusing climax. In the book, like we talked about, the climax is when Smaug is killed, and the Battle of the Five Armies is actually part of the falling action. It's something that ensues because the dragon dies. If the dragon lives, there's no Battle of Five Armies. So the climax happens when Smaug dies, the battle happens, and it's so inconsequential to Tolkien that he doesn't bother writing. In the movies, however, we see Smaug get killed in the first 5 minutes of the Battle of the Five Armies to have a little opening action, and then the climax of the Battle of the Five Armies is the Battle of the Five Armies, which almost feels like a little bit of a betrayal of the first 2 movies. We always thought that the build-up and the climax would be the death of Smaug, but the Battle of Five Armies kind of shifted it, and we just felt off balance in this movie. In terms of the broader scope of the whole trilogy, it feels like the whole trilogy almost has 2 climaxes: Battle of the Five Armies and the death of Smaug, which just makes it confusing, and it's not really the correct flow to the story. If you remove your bias, you'll enjoy the Battle of the Five Armies. If you go into it expecting Lord of the Rings, you're not gonna like it because it's not the Lord of the Rings. It wasn't Tolkien's best work, and it's not Peter Jackson's best work. Love you, bye.